We are pleased to welcome Zoe Caywood, a woman who wears many hats. She was the creator, operator, manager, and eventually the owner of War Eagle Mill for 35 years. With a Bachelor of Science in Journalism from the University of Kansas, she moved to War Eagle in 1973. Her previous job experiences include a cub reporter, a teacher, and a restaurant entrepreneur. She is a cookbook author, a competition black powder shooter, and a record-holding wild turkey hunter. She now is retired and enjoying life, pursuing all these many and varied hobbies and lifestyles.
It was really serendipity, you might say, in rebuilding the War Eagle Mill, because Dad had bought a piece of property at War Eagle because we were an outdoor family. And I have 2 sisters and a brother, and my mother was a small game hunter and fisherman, and she walked in the woods and she searched for birds, and we loved the outdoors. So from Lamar, Missouri, I grew up on Muddy Creek, and Dad bought a piece of property that happened to be 1 mile above the War Eagle Mill Foundation, which was all we had. We had the old War Eagle Mill Foundation. And with that piece of property was deeded that little acre and a half. And we would come down and stay in what was called the Hilltop, and that was an old cabin that had been there for a long time. He actually bought it from a lawyer in Kansas City, Missouri, named Val Lindsay. And we would come down and hunt and fish the Roscoe Hobbs estate. And Mother would pick berries, and we'd walk in the woods on the Roscoe Hobbs. That was way before it became the Hobbs State Park and Conservation Area. And Dad retired. He was a Ford Mercury dealer, among other things. He had several different businesses, but his main business was a Ford Mercury dealer in Lamar. And when he retired, he didn't have an appointment every morning, and so like so many people that have worked all their lives, he became very antsy. And he was very interested in the history of grist milling. He remembers as a boy taking his turn of corn to the mill in Milford, Missouri, which a turn is around 50 pounds, around a bushel of grain, was a turn that you take to the mill and have it converted to cornmeal or flour, whichever grain, wheat or corn that you were taking to the mill. And he started researching the history of War Eagle. And he happened to be at the cabin when the War Eagle Fair was happening one fall, which had began in 1954 by a home extension agent. Well, there were a few thousand people that came to that fair, so Dad thought that if we rebuilt the War Eagle Mill and we sold a 2-pound bag of yellow cornmeal to every person that came to the fair, that this business would be profitable. Because don't get me wrong, Dad was very interested in history, but he was also a self-made man, and he wanted it to turn a profit. Any of his business interests, he wanted them to be profitable, but that was my job. So he contacted me and my first husband, and I was back working for the University of Kansas, the Geological Survey, in a journalism aspect. And my former husband, had gone back to school in biology. And Dad contacted us and said, "Do you want to build a grist mill?" So we immediately went to the library and researched and found out what a grist mill was. And he told me about the history of War Eagle Mill, and it was so colorful that there had been 3 mills on the same foundation, and now there wasn't one. So we ended up packing up our Mother Earth news and going back to the land on a little 125-acre farm. And we had 40 head of mother cows. We had chickens, horses. We had a pig. We butchered. We smoked our hams. I had a huge garden in a rock creek bed in Pine Creek. And we began rebuilding War Eagle Mill. We started in January, and we opened it in October in 1973. And like I said, we had the foundation, And we had the last source of power at the mill was a turbine. And that turbine was still in the Warrigal River. And that was what operated the power source for the third mill. And we had to take a wrecker and pull the turbine out and set it in the lot. But it was broke up by vandals. And it was an old cast Leffel turbine, which had a tremendous amount of power that came from that turbine. But we had no way to repair it. Also, turbines are not visual. Turbines are in the water itself, and so you can't really see them. But we found in our research that the first Warrigal mill had an undershot water wheel. And we thought, well, this is what we're going to build back, was the undershot water wheel. So we researched this history, and I was just enamored with Sylvanus and Catherine Blackburn. Sylvanus had come, he'd stayed in Mudtown, which is, you know, of course, Lowell, Arkansas. And he came out to the Warrigal Valley. He was from Tennessee, and he looked it over and decided this was where he was going to homestead. So he went back to Tennessee and got a lot of his family, including his father, a couple of his uncles, and his wife, Catherine. And they came to Warrigal and started building a house, which is still there. The Blackburn home is still there. It's been sided over, unfortunately, but it's the original log home that Sylvanus and Catherine built. Now, exactly when he got that first mill finished, I don't know, but I do know that it washed away in 1848. The first mill was made, the dam was made of log and stone. It washed away, and he rebuilt it. And then that one was burned during the Civil War. The Confederate Army actually burned the Warrigal Mill, although both armies, the Union Army and the Confederate Army, both ground corn at the Warrigal Mill. The Union Army was grinding corn at the time of the Battle of Pea Ridge. The Union Army was called to come to Pea Ridge. Colonel Dodge at the time was very concerned. He said that the people in the valley, the residents, felt sure that the Confederates would come in if the Union Army pulled out and burn the mill, which is exactly what happened. They pulled out. The next night, the mill was burned by the Confederate Army. So Sylvanus and Catherine went to Texas, and they had a few slaves, this is a curious thing to me that I thought at the time when I found this out, but now I understand more about it. But Vera Key was a great-great-great-granddaughter of Sylvanus Blackburn. And she was a tremendous historian, and you all probably know her because she started and was the driving force for the Rogers Historical Museum. She never, ever spoke to me in all the times that I talked with her that Sylvanus had slaves. But anyway, he did, and he went to Texas and freed the slaves. When he came back then, his son, James A.C. Blackburn, actually rebuilt the mill once again. And it burned down mysteriously in 1924. Before that, it had tremendous capacity for grinding. It ground a lot of barrels of flour a day and was at sometimes even running 24 hours. So, like I say, it burned completely down mysteriously in 1924, but I think it involved a kerosene lantern. And it was told to me by a person years and years ago. He said he saw a man running from the mill as it was afire with a gasoline can. Now, I have no reason to believe that man would have lied to me. He was in very advanced age at the time he told me this story. But anyway, the mill burned down. So from 1924 to 1973, there was nothing at Warrigal except the fair that went on once a year. A lot of things happened in 1907 because James Stringfield, that owned the mill at that time, was a justice of the peace. And I think that's how he also got a lot of things done. And he got this bridge built for $4,500, and he rebuilt the dam. What a great dam it was. Had a head on it, and a good drop, and it provided a lot of power source. And they could open up this gate and let the flow of water in, which is exactly what we did with the undershot water wheel. So we were building, we had framed up just about the first floor of the mill, and we had all of the lumber, which the inside of the mill is sycamore and the outside's oak. And it was all sawed by a one-man sawmill, Clole Carnes in Pea Ridge. And all of that lumber was sitting in that lot, and also every white oak shingle was in that lot when that first flood hit us. And I was up at Dan Greer's stained glass studio, and the sheriff at that time came up and said, you know, that it was dark, it was night, and said that he heard a tremendous sound and he thought sure that the mill was gone. But what it was all those steel bands on those white oak shakes were breaking and splitting apart, and all down the river they went and into Beaver Lake, and also all that lumber. But we persevered. We took boats, and the Corps of Engineers helped us, and we took barges and got that lumber all back. Now, you know, when I say that Dad decided to build this mill back, I still wonder what in the world compelled him. But I think it was that the more people that he talked to that were local residents and people in Rogers told him that it was such a crazy idea to rebuild this Warrigal mill. That's what compelled him. It became a challenge. He went into Ray Harris at the First National Bank, who owned the First National Bank, and Ray was very familiar with Warrigal because he owned property out there. And he knew about the flooding. He knew about the roads. The roads were dirt roads coming in. Both directions were dirt roads. I had a little Pinto Ford car. As you remember, they were little small cars, real cheap, economical car. And every time I came down that road, which is now 98 or Warrigal Road, I had to go sideways across one part because it was all bedrock. And if I went straight or had to meet another car, it drug the bottom of that little old Pinto. And the telephone line that we got was a long and a short. And actually, I went into Southwest Bell, and if you all remember how the Southwest Bell ladies were in those days, I mean, like they controlled the monopoly. And I said, you know, we're building a business out here, and we really need a private line because I can't imagine what the other families are going to feel like if they're on the same line as we are. And she looked at me and she said, not in your lifetime, honey. So Ray Harris knew all that. Ray said to Dad, Jewell, he said, Jewell, you send your daughter in here to the bank, and I will give her a job in our bank. And I think about that now, and I think, well, I might have become a partner and then sold out to Arvest. Think of that. But I wouldn't be here telling you all this story today, and I wouldn't have met Charlie Caywood. Well, my husband and I, Bert Lancaster was his name. No, not the famous Bert Lancaster. Bert made it 2 years, and then we divided ways, and he left. So Dad had driven about 10,000 miles, which is what Dad really liked to do, was he liked to get in that Mercury and drive and meet people. And he was very outgoing, and he knew a lot of people, and every time he'd get a lead, he'd drive to the next old mill and then the next old mill and try to find these burrs and the machinery in order to make this mill operate. And we got, for instance, the pulleys on the inside of the mill came out of the old Barbara Jane mine in Pitcher, Oklahoma. And they were flat belt drives, which was not done. Flat belt drives haven't been done in years and years. We finally found and set in 3 stone burr upright mills. And that's where they do not run horizontal. This is laid out in order to sharpen the stones, but they stand upright. And they don't take as much power. And this undershot water wheel is simply powered by the force of the water. The undershot means that through this sluice, I opened up a gate with a great big wheel on top of it. And I had to climb out on that brick, right, from that old stone, which is part of the old stone foundation, and take that, and I should have counted how many revolutions it was to open that gate up, but it was a lot of them, to let the flow of water in to make that wheel turn. So when the gate opens, it flows and hits the bottom of the undershot water wheel and turns it counterclockwise, versus the more common type of water wheel, which is the overshot, where the water is sluiced in from the top, and then you have the weight of the water hitting that paddle and making it turn, which was a lot more efficient. But in order to have an overshot water wheel, you had to have a gradient from up above. So you had to run the water it had to be where the hole of water was up higher and the mill down low. Well, at Warrigal, the way it is, that's a flat hole running about a mile upstream. So we didn't have any gradient, Sylvanus Blackburn figured all this out. All we were doing was copying what he did. But he had that all figured out and had built this in his first mill, this undershot water wheel. So we didn't have any space, of course, to build that wheel. It's an 18-foot, the first one we built was a redwood, made of California redwood, which supposedly the beavers would not chew. That is incorrect. I want you to know. If anybody asks you, will beavers eat redwood, they love it. I can tell you that. I became a beaver trapper. But anyway, Dad had a friend in Rogers. His name was Jack Musting, and he owned Empire Seed. And Jack really got rich on fescue, and now I look back and I think, oh, Jack, were you wrong? All I do is try to kill fescue now. But anyway, the Empire Seed had a big warehouse in it, and they could lay out that 18-foot water wheel. So then they disassembled it, brought it out, and then started rebuilding it in the sluice. And Chuck Garrett, he was from Lowell, and he was an old-time millwright. And Chuck came out and dressed these stones for us. But in walks, in about 1975, Charlie Caywood into my life. Now, I actually saw him. Mother and I were at a bluegrass festival at the Bentonville Fairgrounds, and I saw this guy outside playing with a band, a bluegrass band, and he had a wash tub bass and a stick on the side of it and a string that ran down the middle of that wash tub bass, and he was strumming along, and he had on a beaver top hat. And Mother looked at me and she said, Zoe Leta, honey, wouldn't you like to meet that character? Well, she didn't have marriage in mind, believe me, from a long shot. But 2 years later, I met him, and we were married. And Charlie was a black powder gun builder, and he had a cabin that he had built at Old Alabama on the Kings River and was building another one up north of Eureka on the Kings River. And he built Kentucky rifles, and he was a historian. He had an education degree and taught 1 year art and history, and then went on to other things in his life. So he came in and actually took everything out that Mom and Dad and I, as far as machinery, had ever put in. First thing he did was, we used to sack all the grain on the second floor of the mill. He moved it and then carry it back downstairs. He moved all the sacking operation onto the first floor. The second things he did was he put me an electric motor on that water gate, so I didn't have to go out there for 30 minutes and crank on that water wheel. He put a gear drive on it with an electric motor. Now, in the meantime, of course, I had to learn how to grind grain. My first product was yellow cornmeal, and that's what we did. We just ground yellow cornmeal. My second product was white cornmeal, and my third was whole wheat flour. But Charlie brought a mixing operation into me. My first mixer was 30 pounds. The next one he built me was 50 pounds. The next one he built me was 150 pounds. And the last one that he built that they're still using at the mill today is 450-pound mixer. I wrote cookbooks. I wrote recipes. In those days, we were called health nuts. Do you remember that term? Health nuts. Because all the grain then, after a few years after building the mill, I decided I wanted to go organic. So all the grain was organically grown. And I wrote whole grain recipes, and I wrote 5 different cookbooks on my days off and at night. And it really was a very varied business because it was retail. I had the gift shop. It was manufacturing wholesale because I also wholesaled the product. It was mail order. Yeah, we started shipping out and doing a bulk mail out back in the late 70s. Then, of course, I developed the mixes. I wrote and photographed all the catalogs. Charlie was great enough. He built me a little studio that I could photograph inside instead of outside, fighting all the bugs. I then later wrote the newsletters, started a website. We had special events. There were a lot of movies because, War Eagle is so absolutely scenic, such a beautiful valley and so pristine. There were a lot of movies after Philip Steele decided that we ought to have films in Arkansas and bring in that revenue, and he was exactly right. We did, War Eagle was the backdrop for the North and South, and it was the backdrop for The Blue and the Gray. A film about Jesse James, and then he goes to War Eagle Cavern after they will open up War Eagle Cavern and hides out his loot, in War Eagle Cavern. We had a lot of people stop by. Lloyd Bridges. What in the world Lloyd Bridges was doing here, I don't know. But, Philip Steele was quite a promoter, and he could have brought Lloyd in to maybe look at doing a movie in Arkansas. Randy Travis was there, and his wife was wonderful because she was a spender. That woman dressed in these beautiful Southwest outfits, and I sold a lot of American Indian jewelry, and boy, when the girls saw her coming in, it was going to make their day because of all the sales. The Virginian, what was his name? James Drury. He was in one day. Charlie also did a movie for Philip Steele called The Lost Treasures of the Ozarks. This old legend that Philip promoted, and I've tried to tell people all through the years, this was legend, But it was, of course, about that there was a fair Indian maiden and a warrior brave, and a fur trapper comes through, and he steals the fair maiden and goes in pursuit and then kills them both. Well, so he talked Charlie into dressing in Charlie's pre-1840 outfit, riding a horse again, and carrying his Kentucky rifle and charging down after War Eagle the Brave. So anyway, it was fun. It was all done on the War Eagle farms. But we did a lot of promotions like that. We did the sesquicentennial promotion back in 1986 to celebrate the sesquicentennial of the state of Arkansas, and we recreated the burning of the mill. We had a battle there where the North and the South attacked on the War Eagle Bridge, and we had cannons and artillery, and we had cavalry there, and these poor soldiers got killed on the bridge, and in the middle of July had to lay out there in those hot wool uniforms. But we had a lot of fun doing it as well. Dad was, he loved the PR end, but he wasn't about to be in the mill and work a cash register or anything else. In the beginning, I talked him into at least working on the books a little bit because he loved math. But past that, he actually opened up a little land speculation, you might say, office in Rogers with Beck Scott, an old friend of his there. And he and Mother always lived in Lamar. They always had their home there, and they just burned up 71 Highway back and forth, back and forth. My gosh, it'd be great if they could see it today, being a 4-lane. When Mother was down there, she was the most help of all because Mother helped me sack cornmeal, whatever needed to be done. And she was when she wasn't at the mill, she was out on the Roscoe Hobbs estate. We documented actually 21 different berries on Roscoe Hobbs's land and made jelly and sold it to the mill. And she would make as many as 1,500 little half-pint jars of jelly to sell at the mill. We had to build a restaurant. I had been a restaurant entrepreneur. It was really a little restaurant that I had built in Lamar, Missouri, after I graduated from college, which was a pure disaster. It was a little chicken carry-out, and I never cut up so much chicken in my life and stood over a French fryer. I said I would never have a restaurant ever again in my whole life. And then the Bean Palace happened. So we built the Bean Palace, And we started serving, of course, cornbread and beans. That was our specialty, along with buckwheat waffles. I don't know where in the world you would go, even to this day, to get a buckwheat waffle. But we did that so that we didn't have to have a cook standing there, and all she did was flip pancakes. You know, we could just put the batter into the iron itself, the waffle iron itself. That and the biscuits and gravy. The biscuits, of course, made from the War Eagle biscuit mix. When we first built the mill, if Mother was there, she and I would be fishing on the bridge. And when somebody would drive up, we would walk down and show them through the mill. Now, that's how times were back in the early 70s. And then later, the traffic started picking up, and all the press releases that I did, people said, "What in the world did you do with a journalism degree and build a grist mill?" And I said, "Bring people to it." That's what it did. That's what helped me. I was able to bring people with very little advertising costs to the mill. And it was so fun to do because the merchandise, the setting, the building itself was so picturesque that everybody wanted to buy a little memento of War Eagle Mill when they came in. Also, we were the first new grist mill built in Arkansas in 90 years, and we were the only, and still yet, the only working undershot water wheel left in the United States. Now, lots of undershots were built, but because they had to sit right down on the power source, they most all washed away, exactly like War Eagle did the first time, and may yet one of these days. So anyway, we built the Bean Palace restaurant up where in the original mill they actually would have stored the grain up there. So if you were to look at the front of the mill, you'll see that there's the Dutch doors, the double doors up on the third floor. Well, that was because they'd pull the wagon up in front of the mill and pulley the grain up into the third floor out of that floodplain, of course, and then gravity feed it down to the mills. Well, I sold the mill in 2004, and then I worked for 3 years after that for the mill itself as general manager, and then retired. I feel like I've skipped around a lot there trying to explain to you what it was like to build a grist mill, but I can't tell you how primitive the situation was and how self-sufficient we had to be. But look at Sylvanus and Catherine Blackburn. And I'll tell you the story of Sylvanus and Catherine. Catherine died first, and Sylvanus said, well, she was my childhood sweetheart. They actually had been married when they were 16. And he said, I no longer have the will to live. And Sylvanus was a very religious man, and he had a Bible study room that he built in that old Blackburn home. He went into that Bible study room because he gave the orders to dig Catherine's grave wide and leave it open. And he went into the Bible study room and pined away. At the end of 5 days, Sylvanus was dead, and they buried him with Catherine. And there's a beautiful headstone, old headstone out in the War Eagle Cemetery, which is a great cemetery, I think, to visit. And it's a tall one and arched, and that's over Sylvanus and Catherine's grave. So they were a very romantic couple, but it was amazing what they did in order to make a thriving settlement. And that first thing that Sylvanus did was build a grist mill so they could convert their grains into something that would be palatable. Now, there are a lot of theories on how War Eagle got its name, and I was told a lot of different stories at the time that we were building the mill. And I did a lot of research at the university in the special collections. But the best information that I have was from Chief Boyd. And Chief Boyd was the head of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. And someone told me to contact Chief Boyd. So I did. And I talked with him about this. And he said that he thought that it was named for an Osage Indian chief, which was named Hurkai. And in the years to come, I was able to get a copy of an 1825 St. Louis treaty, And the 13th sub-chief to sign that treaty's name was Hurricane, which translates the War Eagle. And I think that's where it got its name. You can bring in a grist of corn and have it ground on the shares and have a toll for the thrifty miller, as Vance Randolph would say. But they would take a toll, and I did too. I had an old toll chart, and the last toll chart that I had, 1/5 of the grain the miller kept. And I had people actually that would come in, bring their grain in, and have it ground. And they, they'd grow it in their gardens mostly, and then bring it in, and I would grind it for them. I will never forget this one little old lady. It's just a precious woman that came in, and a hard-working Arkansas woman. And she brought in her corn, and they always brought in white corn. I mean, that was the old primo corn. In this area, it was white corn. We're just 125 miles north of here in Lamar, Missouri, everybody had yellow cornmeal. But here in War Eagle and around this area, everybody grew in brought in white corn. And it was primarily hickory cane. It was an open pollinated corn, which then I strove to buy in the years to come when I realized what it was. But anyway, this little old lady comes in, and she's bringing me her grist, her turn of corn, about a bushel of corn, and that was going to be to feed her family for that year, of course. And she had saved back enough to make hominy. And I said, she told me she was 82, and I said, oh my, you must be a native of Arkansas. And she said, oh no, honey, but I've lived here 81 years. There was a businessman in Rogers, and his name was Frank Strode. And he was a wonderful man and a great supporter, and he was just like a father to me. But he built Rogers Vinegar, and he had several other businesses. But he had a cabin. He was the nephew of Roscoe Hobbs, and he had a cabin, which is still there, at War Eagle. And what happened was that he got enough money together to save that dam because the fishermen decided somewhere in the late 50s that the fish weren't able to get upstream, and they wanted to be able to get upstream. They, of course, not taking into account, I mean, look at the floodwaters. All the fish go up that want to go up there. Okay, but anyway, so they dynamited out the center part of that dam, and Frank got enough money together to rebuild it. So that center part is a lot higher than what the rest of the dam is. But the rest of the dam's just that old conglomerate concrete that was built in 1907. And when the water is real low, if you stand there on the War Eagle Bridge and look down, you can see that right on the upside of the dam, there's an old cedar fence that's laid in there. And it's been in there since 1907. They laid that's why cedar just doesn't break down in water. And they laid that fence in there in order they thought that it would help the logs get up over that dam instead of beat against it and break it off. But the dam, we've done some patchwork. We did some patchwork on it, Charlie and I did, back several years ago. But it's the original, except for that center section, 1907 dam.